Okay, how many of you have heard that ever? At a wedding, funeral, maybe a memorial service, sometimes you hear it. Some of us probably almost have that passage memorized. It's the famous chapter on love. And there's a danger with that. At least there's two dangers that I can think of in preaching this passage. One is that we're so used to hearing its lofty language at important occasions that we sort of discount it as what it may say to us in our daily lives. That's for weddings. That's for memorial services. That's the big thing. That's what those young people, bless their hearts, those naive young people need to hear when they're getting ready to get married. But we don't have to, we know all that stuff. We've already stopped talking to each other, so we don't have to worry about being rude or anything like that. You see, we tend to put it off, and we say we've heard it before. That's one danger of it. In fact, there's an interesting, I'm not going to read this whole thing, even though I had it written down. There was an interesting misapplication of this verse by a guy who was a chaplain of a boys' boarding school in England. And there's a whole long thing where it says, essentially, if you go through this chapter and substitute the word gentleman every time that you see the word love, then you'll hear what this passage is about. Because to be a gentleman is to be a loving person, like it says in this passage. And then the person's comment who responded to it says, as if Jesus died on the cross and went through the scourging and the torture that he did, just so that we can become gentlemen. It was a misapplication. And so people use this passage for all different kinds of things and don't look at it as the way it's supposed to be looked at. A text that teaches us how to live together, particularly in the church. The second danger that I have to mention is that, unfortunately, the Christian world is these days divided into, very broadly speaking, painting with a broad brush now. I'm painting with a brush that's maybe 10 feet wide. So I'm going to tar some people, paint some people like they shouldn't necessarily be painted. But the Christian world is divided into two camps. And one of those on one side is always talking about love. We should just love one another. All we have to do is love. All you need is love, like the Beatles say. And so if we love and we tolerate each other, the world would be a much better place. We could all hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and everybody would get along. And so the other side of the camp, it's not so much that thinks there's more to the world than just loving each other, but I just gave it away. Shouldn't do that. What that camp tends to do is say, as soon as you hear about love, you think, oh, well, that's all that other stuff. We don't need to hear that. And the fact of the matter is, yes, we do. We all need to hear about love and about what love is like in this passage. So I want to look at that this morning, and I want to just give you those little warnings before we go in, because this passage is about daily life that everyone needs to hear, particularly people in the church. A little bit of background. You probably already know this. There's, in English, we have only one word for love. Unfortunately, we're sort of impoverished that way. So we can say things like, I love pizza, or I love chocolates, or we can say, I love it when my wife does the laundry, or I love it when my husband cooks. Right? We have a whole broad range of things. Greater love has no one than this, that he lays down his life. And so here's a soldier that's laid down his life in love for his country. There's a broad range of things that we use the word love for. We need more words, I think. The Greeks had 4 words for love to talk about 4 different dimensions of love. The first one that I want to mention briefly is eros. Eros, as you might suspect, is the root word that we have for erotic. That should get your attention, at least for a little bit. Erotic love, the love between a husband and a wife. The love between men and women, the attractive love that's sort of I don't want to go into it right now. But it's that kind of physical love that's very feeling-oriented and attractive, and it's passionate. That's eros in Greek. There's also a word in Greek called philos, which is the word for brotherly affection or love. In fact, we have a city in our country called Philadelphia, and it's called, the motto of the city is it's the city of brotherly love. Right. And that's because philos is love, and adelphos comes from the Greek word which means brother. So it's the city where all of the brothers love each other. And they had that word for love in Greek, philos. Then there was another word for love that was sort of a family friendship kind of love, which was storge. Means, I really like my best friend. I love my best friend. And they could say that, and everybody would know what they meant. So there's three words, and then the last word that the Greeks had for love was agape. It was not a widely used word. It usually applied only to the gods. And so the Greeks, when they were talking about love that the gods had, the Greek gods and the Roman gods, and for their creation was used for that. It wasn't used very much because the Greek gods were so capricious that you couldn't count on them for anything. They could count on them to be unpredictable, I guess. But when the Christian faith came along, they picked up on this word love and used it to describe God's love for the undeserving in particular. It was a love that God had for his creation, whether we deserved it or not. Calvin picks up on this. I wanted to read this little short paragraph from Calvin. It's from the Golden Booklet of the True Christian Life. And he talks about the necessity for Christians to love and do good to one another. And here's what he says. The Lord commands us to do good, or to love, unto all people without exception, even though the majority are very undeserving when judged according to their own merits. He goes on to say, if anyone therefore appears before you who is in need of your kind services, you have no reason to refuse them your help. And he goes on to give example after example after example, which I wish I could read. He says, here's an example. Suppose he is despicable and worthless, this person who appears before you who needs your help. Yet the Lord has deemed him worthy to be adorned with his own image. So you owe it to the person to help them out in whatever they need, no matter how undeserving they are. So Calvin picks up on this same kind of love, this love for people who are even undeserving of it. That's the word that we're talking about here in 1 Corinthians 13. And there's only, you're not going to believe this, there's only three things I want to say about this whole chapter. We could spend a month of Sundays in this chapter, but I'm only going to say three things today. First of all, comes from verse 1. Without this love, we are offensive to others as a Christian. Christians who are without agape love offend other people. Another word for offend is we annoy other people. And everybody here has known Christians who annoyed people thinking that they're doing good. So here's what it says in verse 1. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Even if I speak with all of the eloquence that men and angels, and you can imagine how angels speak, the fluency and eloquence of their language, how they can alliteratively put together all the big words in the world to make it sound just like a gorgeous speech. If a person does all of that and doesn't have the kind of love that gives of itself to the other people, it says that we've become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. So here's an example. I thought this would be good. I want to tell you all about salvation. God is so love in the gospel, and if you don't have the kind of practical love that shows people that you really care, that's what you are. That's what we all are when we treat people like that, when we don't have that love in our hearts. Here's what Calvin says again. You guys should read this book. This is just a wonderful book by Calvin. It's all about how our heart attitude and our actions both should be towards our fellow human beings, even though they're undeserving. Calvin says this: it may even happen that a person discharges his duty to love to the best of his abilities, but if his heart is not in it, he falls far from the mark. There are people who are known to be very liberal and generous, and yet they never give without scolding or pride or insolence. How many times I've heard this before? Well, we give these food baskets to these people, and most of them don't appreciate it at all. Most of them are just going to be in the same situation another 2 weeks. If they were just different, that's what Calvin is talking about, and that's what this text is talking about. It doesn't matter what they are. We have a responsibility to love and to make them feel as though we love them. And if we don't, it's just all about that. So we are offensive and annoying if we don't have love for the people around us, especially people in the church. Secondly, that I want to look at this morning, without this love, without this kind of self-sacrificing love for others, even though they don't deserve it, we are nothing. Lovelessness repels people from the church. It just does. There are people, let's see, how can I say this? Everybody here knows somebody who maybe used to come to church, but somebody said something or somebody did something somewhere in the ancient past, and now they won't come anymore. Because not just this church, but all you Christians are just a bunch of hypocrites. Well, okay, that's true. Lovelessness repels people from church. But it also makes me and you and us, our lives, as nothing, as unusable for God's glory. Notice, this is an interesting thing. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries, okay? If prophecy in the New Testament was the technical term for hearing the word of the Lord and declaring it to others. So here's a person who has a gift of prophecy. Somebody who can wonderfully hear and expound God's word for other people. And they might even have all knowledge. And they might even understand all of these mysteries. But if we don't have, and they might even have faith, the kind of faith that moves mountains. But if we don't have love, it makes us nothing. It makes us worthless. Now, I think I can criticize from within their tradition, because I'm in the tradition. The Reformed tradition really falls down here a lot. Some of the most... John Calvin has a reputation for being a cold-hearted, mental giant who didn't really care about people. It's not Calvin that was like that. It was his followers who became like that. Some of the most cold-hearted people in the world are the Reformed, Presbyterian people. Why do you think we're called the frozen chosen? It's because that's the way we are. Just tell me what you want me to know. You know, approach my mind, but don't approach my heart. Don't approach, me with anything but your mind and Reformed doctrine. Even if I understand, as it says in here, all mysteries, what about the Trinity? The Incarnation? What if I can brilliantly explain all of that to you and help you to understand mysteries that only angels can look into and have not love? You know what it does for me? Nothing. At least according to the Scriptures. So you can understand all this stuff, but if you don't have love in your heart others, it's worth nothing. You could understand all knowledge. You could understand predestination and election and algebra 2. And if you don't have love, it's worth nothing. There's a lot of things like that in the faith. Even if we have faith to move mountains, Jesus talked about mountain-moving faith. Jesus talked about having the kind of people that can boldly go where no person has gone. Well, that was Star Trek. Jesus talked about mountain-moving faith. And yet, if we have faith as to be able to move mountains and don't have love, it's worth nothing. Remember that? That's what I think explains that passage in Matthew 7 at the end. It's always been a terrifying passage to me because Jesus says it's not those who hear the word. Let me read it to you because I'll botch it if it's not one of those passages I've memorized. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. I think one of the ways that you explain that is that there are people who can prophesy. There are people who have the kind of faith that can drive demons out of people, and if there's no love behind it, Jesus is going to say to us, I never knew you. It's not the people who can explain all of those things. It's the people who have the love in their heart to explain those things with love to others. That's what does something. That's what says something in God's eyes about us. And the third thing, and hopefully this will be the shorter thing, without love, we gain nothing. Verse 3, Paul says, if I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. If we give away all that we have, and Jesus did tell us to give freely. Jesus says, give to everyone who asks of you, give without expecting anything in return. But it says here we can even do that and give away everything. And if we don't have love, it counts for nothing for us. Or he goes on to say, if I surrender my body to the flames. Some people think that that's an allusion to martyrdom. Quite often in Paul's day, Christians were persecuted, and one of the ways that they were persecuted is that they were set on fire and burned at the stake. And Paul says, you can even give up your life, surrender your body to be burned as a martyr, and if you don't have any love, it's not worth anything. It doesn't gain you anything. You can imagine people perhaps going to the stake as a Christian and having nothing but hatred in their hearts for those people who are persecuting us. Boy, if I could come down off this stake right now, even though I'm burning to death, you get yours. If you go to the stake and offer your body to be burned and don't have love, it's not worth anything. Those are the kinds of things that I think we need to hear about. If we, love is so important as a defining characteristic of what it means to be a church and what it means to be a Christian, is that in its absence, non-believers can question whether or not the faith is even true. Let me read you this from the Gospel of John, chapter 13, verses 34 and 35, where, by the way, the same word for love is used, agape. John 13, 34 and 35. I just turned one page too far. Jesus says to his disciples on the night on which he's being betrayed, a new commandment I give you, love one another, agape one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And then listen to this. All people will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. The defining characteristic of whether those outside the church will know whether we are really disciples of Jesus is if we have that kind of love for one another. 1 Corinthians 13 kind of love. So in that sense, hear these words. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It does not seek its own. It does not seek to get its own way. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongdoing. Keeps no record of wrongdoing. I've got a list as long as, well, love does not delight in evil, but delights in what is good and true. Those are the kinds of things that should characterize our relationships in the church. And if it doesn't, if we don't love each other that kind of way, Jesus says people outside can say, I don't recognize you as Christians. It's not evident to me that you all are a group of Christian people because you're not loving each other the way Christian people are supposed to love. So that's the importance of what we're talking about here. Lastly, and this is the last thing I want to say, notice this. This kind of love is God's love. It's poured out into our hearts. It's not something that we manufacture. Let me read this to you. It's from the same author, only it's in one of his letters, the letter of John, chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. Oh, that was chapter 3. Here we go, chapter 4. This is love. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. That's what this is about. This reminds us Sunday by Sunday of the extent to which God went in Jesus to demonstrate his love for a lost world. And John says, since this is true, we also ought to love one another in the same way. Let's bow our heads and hearts in prayer.